You might have seen the word turbo plastered on the side or badged somewhere on a car, but even if you don't know what a turbo is or what they do, you know that they're synonymous with being fast. Well then, I welcome you to the 2010 Porsche Panamera Turbo, which by the way has two of them for extra fast.
Chuki got the sauce,
So it all begins with that engine. It's a 4.8 liter V8 twin turbo engine making about 500 horsepower and 516 pound-feet of torque. Now the power delivery is very linear and very buttery smooth, and it almost feels as if the car is faster than 500 horsepower. Now when you look down at the numbers, it makes sense that it's about 500 horsepower, but the sheer feeling of the acceleration, it just kicks you back into your seat. Like I'll demonstrate now, like that, and it just juts you back, and that torquey feeling makes it feel a lot faster than what it is what I'm trying to say. And what's really crazy about that is that this car weighs about 4,000 pounds, which is essentially a baby elephant. So maybe in that last little demonstration it seemed that it was a little bit slow to respond, but I didn't have the car in Sport Plus, so I'll put it into Sport Plus. And here we go. There you go. It's almost deceptively quick because you wouldn't expect a car this big to be this quick. And what's crazier is that this is the first iteration of the Panamera Turbo. This is essentially the foundations of this car. And they've built on it so much more that the newer generations have almost about 700 horsepower. So the real star of the show is this PDK transmission. It makes complete use of that engine. Without it, it would just fall flat on its face. The shifts are so lightning quick, and the way it's tuned for this engine, with the gear ratios and everything, the whole rev range is just so usable. So there's three ways that you can tell that you have a PDK transmission. Now the first being that if you actually drive the car, you'll be able to tell right away because the gear shifts are so lightning quick. Now the second way is that you got this branding here on the shift lever itself. Right underneath it says PDK. And now the third way is that you'll have launch control. Now the launch control in Porsche vehicles is probably the best in the automotive industry, hands down, because it comes down to its usability and how dialed in it is. Even on this car, which is almost 12 years old, you can launch it back to back and it'll just take it all day long. I tried doing that in a BMW M4, and in their owner's manual it says after completing a launch you gotta drive it around for about 15 minutes to let it cool down. What is that? Even in a Nissan GTR, probably one of the best launching cars ever, you gotta wait for it to cool down, because if you do it too many times back to back, the differential will start to overheat. Now the 0 to 60 acceleration in this car is about 4 seconds. Now with launch control active and some good tires, you can get that sub 4 seconds, which is crazy. So to activate launch mode in this is probably the easiest in any car that I've had to do it in. You just activate Sport Plus mode, put it in drive, left foot brake, right foot hammer down, and you just do it. So if you were a 911 owner prior to the Panamera line when it was introduced, you probably had to store your 911 in the winter if you lived in colder climates, or you had a family sedan to accompany it as being your daily driver. Now when the Panamera was introduced, I'm sure that Porsche targeted that demographic, being that their lineup didn't have a family sedan in it. And why should Porsche give up their piece of the market share when they could easily do it themselves and keep their 911 customers in the family? Now that being said, this car had something to prove and had a lot of expectations to meet because it wears a Porsche badge. Now that means driving dynamics. Now a Porsche is just not a Porsche if it doesn't have driving dynamics. It has to drive like a Porsche. Now, what I mean by that is like a BMW. If you've ever driven a BMW, there's a particular feel of a BMW across its whole lineup of cars. To experience the Porsche driving dynamics in this car, it's imperative that you drive it in Sport Plus mode. Now what that does is that the whole car will hunker down because it is on air suspension. Now with that you get increased aerodynamics, and of course with the rear spoiler deploying, that will give you some kind of downforce gripping you to the road. Now in addition, the air suspension will stiffen up to the point where you can actually noticeably feel that there is a difference in the terms of feedback of the road. So does this car live up to the expectation? Does it drive like a Porsche? Well, I gotta say that yes, it does. Especially if you have this car in Sport Plus mode. The way this thing handles for its size is really crazy. It just has so much mechanical grip. Equipped with an all-wheel drive system, which just has so much traction, it's insane what you can actually pull off with this car. Especially in long sweeper turns, it's just planted. It just goes around the corners like it's on rails. In tighter corners, it is quite apparent that it is of its size. It is a size of a whale after all. But with that being said, there's obviously going to be some give and take. You can carry 4 people and you can probably put in some crazy lap times. And by the way, there's a sport chrono and you can time your lap times, which is crazy. So the front axle line is somewhere around here, and as you can clearly see, most of the engine's weight is ahead of that. Now that's weird to see because in a sports car you would want to have most of the weight more towards the center of the car to give you a better center of gravity. And also, you don't want that much weight hanging over the front wheels because you will have more tendency to understeer into corners. But the way that this car handles, it's astonishing that it handles the way it does. So if we're talking about the exhaust and the sounds that this car makes, I gotta say it's a little lackluster, especially in the modern age. With this car having a 4.8 V8 engine, most of the sounds that come into the cabin are from the engine. And with the modern times and the way how the car industry is, and the engine sound being pumped in through the speakers, I gotta say it's refreshing to be able to hear just the engine note. Like, put the foot down and that's just all engine sound. It's not being pumped in whatsoever. There was a sport exhaust system which was an option from factory on the Panamera Turbos, but this car unfortunately is not equipped with it, and without it really it's quite lackluster, as I said. But of course you can put aftermarket exhausts on this and they do sound quite nice actually. So let's address the elephant in the room. This car is UGLY. You ain't got no L, but you ugly. Now I know that looks are subjective and some of you out there will find this car nice, but let's be honest, this car is teetering on the objective scale of ugliness. So I'll go more into depth on why I think that is. So let's begin with the front end, starting with the headlights here. Now the headlights are very reminiscent of the 996 911s, which I'm not a very big fan of. I think it would have been nicer had they gone with a more 997 style, which is essentially just omitting this part here. It kind of ends up looking like a very bug front end. But the overall design, especially with the daytime running lamps down here, which are the LEDs, it still gives it a very modern kind of look. By no means does this car look outdated for a car that is over 10 years old. At the back end, what I find weird are the taillights, which seem a little bit too bulbous, and they seem to be placed a little bit too high for my liking. What I prefer is the newer style of Panamera taillights, which are a lot more sleeker, and they span all the way across right underneath the Porsche logo, and it integrates a lot more nicely. Another one of my favorite design features is the rear spoiler, which actually deploys kind of like this, and it looks kind of like a swan flapping its wings. It's very cool. Unfortunately, though, it's defective. I think for me, the design oddities really come into play in the side profile. And I think that's because they really tried to give it that 911 design language, and it kind of just falls apart in the profile. Because it is such a long car, it's kind of hard to really extend those lines. I think for me, the problem lies right here, where it's kind of in between a shooting brake and a four-door coupe sleek design. Now, if you may know, on the newer Panameras, they've actually divided into two different models, one being a shooting brake and having the full extension, and the other being the four-door coupe. So let's talk about the interior a little bit and some of the features in here. So I gotta say right off the bat that these seats are tremendous. The amount of bolstering that you get and the comfort level ratio is quite nice. This is one of the first cars I've ever sat in where the seat pan on the bottom actually has its own bolstering. You can actually adjust how much you are held in by your legs, which is crazy. I've never had that before. Now, because there is so much adjustability in the seats, it is kind of hard to find your way around here on the side, but once you're used to it, you're used to it. Accompanying the seats, the seating position in this is probably one of the best I've experienced in any car, hands down. The visibility is just so great. The windshield is nice and big. The dash itself is nice and flat. All I have is the steering wheel and then a straight clear vision of the road ahead. From a design perspective, the interior, if you're not used to Porsche's design, I could see how it can be a little bit boring, being that everything is very flat surfaced, as well as having that shelf on top. And moving down to the pedestal, I gotta say that it hasn't aged very well, and that's mainly due to having so many buttons, because the more modern vehicles, namely the Porsche Taycan, all the vehicle functions are on screens nowadays. And since automotive design is moving towards that, I have to say that this in a few years is probably going to look very dated. But overall, this interior is a very nice place to be. Everything is finished quite nicely. We have leather wrapped everywhere. We have carbon fiber trimmings, nice metallic feeling handles. We have a suede or Alcantara headliner, and just overall the amount of space and comfort, even from a driver's perspective, like I said, everything's within hand's reach. It's almost effortless, I would have to say. And the amount of headroom as well as leg room for both passengers in the front and the rear. The Panamera Turbo is great at what it does. It has this split personality where you get the comfort of a luxury car, and then at the touch of a button you get supercar levels of performance. This car offers performance that I know if I owned this car, I wouldn't miss my supercar in the winter. And I think it's worth mentioning that when this car first came out, I absolutely hated it, and that mainly came down to the looks. But after driving it, I completely understand what this car is about, and I can put the looks past it. Because the drive is where it's at, and I think that's Porsche as a brand as a whole. And I think it's the same reason why I like BMWs, because they have a heritage which they value, and they showcase that in each one of their cars, whether it be a 3 Series, a 5 Series, or a 7 Series. And I think I see the same thing in the Porsche brand. Now, from the outside looking in on the Porsche brand, it may seem a little confusing since they're so centered around the 911, and it's kind of hard to distinguish between the models if you don't know about them. And I feel like it's kind of glossed over as a supercar option because of this confusion. But what really spoke to me after driving this car was the Porsche build quality. The ride was sublime, the interior was well put together, there's no creaks or noises, and the car can hang with the best of sports cars and supercars of today. And it made me think that when you buy a Porsche, there's almost a peace of mind that 10 years later this car is still going to be running strong and ride like it does when it was new. Whereas other brands and cars, you kind of think of them as a lease or a flip after 3-4 years, you kind of want to get out of them. This car is worthy of keeping.